Hi, this is James for ChessGoals. This is a preview chapter from our E6 Indian defense course where we cover sidelines like the D4 systems that you'll see in this chapter on the London system, as well as the Ready and the English. Please check out the link in the description to enroll in the course for free.
All right, we're on chapter number 1, the London system. What are we going to look at in this chapter, James?
Well, welcome. So in this chapter, we're looking at the classic London system. So early bishop f4, probably knight f3, and that really solid London system triangle with d4, c3, and e3. We'll cover the more aggressive Jabava London in a separate chapter because we do need to meet it in a very specific way. And really, Matt, what we're going to do in this chapter is take all the fun out of the London, what little fun there is to begin with, out of it for white. And we're going to give them a real strong dose of their own medicine. We're going to employ a system that has been used by both Veselin Topalov and Magnus Carlsen, both against Gadakamsky, both winning against Gadakamsky, using basically the Queen's Indian, just with a few little quirks that I'll point out along the way. We'll jump into it, see what we're talking about. Obviously, your opponent starts with d4. We play knight f6. And now we're going to cover the London through the 2 bishop f4 move order, Matt. So in the database, this is played about 2/3 of the time, with knight f3 1/3 of the time, if they're going for a London system specifically. 2 knight f3 doesn't pose any challenges to us. You can just play 2 e6, at which point your opponent needs to elect, are they going to play c4 and allow b6, getting a Queen's Indian, or are they going to commit to a London system with knight f3 or e3? So they can't move order us with 2 knight f3. 2 bishop f4 does give some additional aggressive options for white. And so we're covering that move order so we can show you all their little tricks and traps along the way.
I like that.
2 e6. We're just being flexible. We're going into a Queen's Indian defense formation. We're Queen's Indian players, so that's how we'll meet it. E3, overwhelmingly the main move. Again, knight f3 is playable here. Doesn't change anything for us. And now c5. This is the first little wrinkle. We're not playing b6. And that's because in recent years, white has actually developed a system with a very early queen f3. And playing the immediate b6 actually does allow that on pretty good terms. And white scores quite well there. It's one of the only lines where white is pushing for an advantage. So what we're doing by starting with c5 is when we then play b6, delaying, weakening this diagonal for a move. Now when queen f3 comes, we can play knight c6, and we haven't blocked in our c pawn. So it's just a little wrinkle, but there's a good reason for it. Okay. We'll look at c3 now, and moves like knight f3 or bishop d3 don't change anything, but c3 is the most popular move. Well, now we can play our b6, and we're going to be fianchettoing our bishop. It is a Queen's Indian, but it's unclear to which square that bishop will go, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. The main move here has been knight f3. They can play moves like knight bd2 or h3. These are moves, Matt, a London system player is going to play anyway. And so really the opening in this chapter is a little bit both sides hands off, both sides just develop their pieces. There's no real conflict. So those non-confrontational moves like a knight bd2, like an h3, even like a bishop d3, don't change anything. We're still going to go for, they're going to go for their setup. We're going to go for our setup.
And
so nothing too much to worry about.
You know what I like about this system, James, is we're not playing pawn to d5. And as a London player, I think they love seeing that pawn on d5, getting their standard attacking structure. We're going to play with some flexibility here. Just kind of a teaser for the viewers.
Yeah. And we're going to highlight a couple of key points. And actually, I should have confessed this earlier. I'm a dedicated London system player myself, and I know statistically speaking, d4, d5 is absolutely what you're looking for as a London system player. It's where they score the best. So we are holding back this d pawn. We've got something different in mind. So now bishop e7, and this will be the first move that might be surprising both to the viewer but also to your opponent. Why aren't we playing the more natural bishop b7, which is the main move in the database. So bishop e7 has two functions. Well, one, we're starting to take control of this diagonal, and we may very well want to hunt down the London bishop with knight h5 in the future. Before you can do that, you must control g5 so that they cannot meet knight h5 with bishop g5 and just trade attack your queen, force you to play bishop e7, trade the dark square bishops. Because if we're going to grab the London bishop, we want the bishop pair as well. We want it on the best possible terms. But we're also delaying the deployment of our bishop, because what our goal is in this chapter, Matt, and you've foreshadowed here, is white is going to play bishop d3 and look to set up a kingside attack. We're waiting for them to play bishop d3 so we can play bishop a6, trade the light square bishops, remove white's critical key attacking piece, and gain a tempo while doing it, because typically the pattern is bishop a6 and then they take on a6 as well. So we've forced their bishop to move twice. We're going to then combine that in the middle game with d6, not d5, to take away white's other really strong attacking idea, which is knight e5, f4. And once you've done that, white's goal in these London system structures is that kingside attack. We've really prevented that already. They haven't got the light square bishop. They haven't got a knight coming to e5. It's very difficult for white to drum up an attack. And not only that, all of this will flow nicely into what our long-term plan is, which we'll reveal shortly. So we're going to cover a couple of moves on move 6, but we're going to begin with the main line, which is h3. Every London course I've ever purchased talks about you meet bishop e7 with h3, because they want to. There are players that will play knight h5 on the next move to try and take this bishop. So h3 is what I expect you to face. It's actually not necessary. We're not really looking to grab the bishop this early, but h3 is the main move. We can now castle. We're still delaying the deployment of this bishop. We really want them to play bishop d3. Now knight bd2. We'll circle back and cover bishop d3, the less challenging immediate bishop d3. But really, white at this point should probably be realizing, hang on, something's going on with this light square bishop. I'm going to, and you start doing this little dance where neither side wants to develop their light square bishop. So what I wanted to cover, Matt, was, well, what do? You need to find other moves. And the good news is we've got lots of other moves that we can play before we are forced to move our light square bishop.
I was going to ask, in your games, James, how often do you find your opponents who are playing the London are aware of this, waiting for their light bishop to move your light bishop?
They not. I don't know how often they're aware of it. I would honestly say they mostly just don't bother. They just get it over with and play bishop d3 and just continue on.
Okay.
They accept that it's going to happen, because white can get into quite a bit of trouble trying to avoid it. So knight bd2 is a great waiting move, and then we could maybe play. Well, we're going to play something else here, but if we wanted to keep waiting, we have moves like d6, h6, rook e8. They don't really have as many good waiting moves, and then you can actually prepare to break in the middle while they're still stalling. So there's really not a lot white can do to not just get on with it and play bishop d3 or bishop e2 and continue developing. So we can find plenty of useful moves. That's not a problem.
They're at pretty much already out of moves, at least for for pieces. Maybe a pawn move or two, but that's it.
Yeah, so we can still play plenty of useful moves. Like I said, d6, h6, and rook e8. There's 3 just easy ones. Those are moves we'd like in this structure anyway. Again, just why h6, it controls the g5 square. We talked about that being quite useful. So first, sort of like motif in this variation, they've now played knight bd2. Matt, if we now take in the middle and they take back with the c pawn, that knight cannot come to c3 in one move where it will be actively placed. So we have waited, we've left this pawn tension. We haven't really mentioned it. We have left these pawns in tension until this knight has moved. So now we can chop in the middle. If they take back with the c pawn, this knight will be misplaced in the remaining structure. So the natural recapture is, of course, e takes. We will talk about c takes in a moment, but with the e takes, the knight is well placed. And what this does is actually why we've timed this capture right now, it's a very subtle idea. In the long term, the strongest plan for white against the Queen's Indian down the line is actually Queen E2 and then pushing E3 to E4, E4 to E5, which what brilliant course may have covered that plan in detail, Matt? Do you have any ideas?
You tell me.
That is the plan in the ChessGoals London system course, and it is actually White's best scoring plan in the whole Queen's Indian structure. So we're throwing in this capture now to just take that off the table. We're really doing everything we can to disarm and disable White early on. So we're not letting them get bishop d3. We're not letting them get knight e5. We're not even letting them get in the central pawn pushes. We're just taking away all of their weapons and trying to leave them pretty helpless.
And not just in the London system, but when you see a white pawn on e5 dislodging your knight on f6, you always have to be aware of the kingside attack. So I love that we're taking this opportunity right now. Get rid of their e-pawn.
Yeah, yeah. So now we're still waiting for bishop d3, and we're going to highlight, well, we've got time. So we're going to play d6 ourselves, take control of that e5 square. It's a very useful move for us, not only to control e5, but we very often are using the d7 square either for a knight or very often to go queen d7 and then queen b7 after this bishop is gone and traded. The queen sits incredibly well on this long diagonal, just influencing these central light squares. And that will also facilitate the connection of rooks later on. So d6, nice multi-purpose move. At this point, overwhelmingly, bishop d3 is the main move. White just has to get castled and finish developing. And so we can hit them with bishop a6, the move we've been waiting the entire time for. So why bishop a6 and not bishop b7, which is the main move? Well, it just works really, really well. We're going to trade off White's best piece. They don't have, at that point, really any other active plans, and we're just going to try and grind them down from there, and we'll show you how to do that in the course. Bishop b7 is the main move, but that actually scores about even in the titled player database, because it's just a complex, middle game where both sides have plans. In the titled players database, bishop a6 scores really, really well because it just takes away really the active plans that White may have, and it would be my strongest recommendation. Indeed, I've actually got in the notes, Black scores 58% from here in 508 games. That's a really really good score with the black pieces, especially when you realize, well, hang on, White's just gone for the exact setup you're taught to go for in the books. White has made no mistakes. If you put it on the engine, White has made no inaccuracies.
And playing the white pieces, I'd be happy to see 58%. Playing the black pieces is even crazier because you should be about 4% lower than white. One tactical note I have, James, if you're watching this video and you forget the move order a little bit and you're kind of waiting for bishop to d3, be aware of the tactic if your king was still on e8 and you played bishop a6, because I see this all the time in openings across the board. Watch for bishop.
Exactly where this is going. Yeah.
Yeah, watch for bishop takes bishop, you take back, and then the queen comes out to a4, forking your king and the undefended piece. So you shouldn't have that happen because you're following my recommendations, but just keep that in mind. Like, make sure you don't open up your king for that tactic.
I think your opponent could play like a very early bishop d3, and you just want to have that mental note that you've now given Matt, oh, hang on, I need to castle before I play bishop a6. Yeah. Just to avoid that attack. Because they could just go for the very, very immediate bishop d3 on like move 4 or something and play a really funky move order. But so it's worth highlighting.
If the d pawn's back though, then you're safe. So you can keep that in mind too. Like here we just played d6.
True. Yeah. Okay, so we'll start with bishop a6, which is overwhelmingly the main move, but we'll also look at when White refuses, they don't capture, which by the way, that's good for us too. We're quite happy with that. Now knight a6. We, of course, I say in the comments, of course we recapture in this course. Yeah, that's the sort of like fine chess instruction that you're paying for. We recapture the piece. White now castles. And now the key move of this variation. We're going to go on a bit of a knight tour here, but this is, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So we start with knight c7. And from here, the knight does a couple of things. It's going to come to d5, and gain a tempo on the London bishop. So we're actually not losing time redeploying the knight. And the knight's going to be absolutely fantastic on the d5 square. So a benefit of not having a pawn on d5 is we can actually put a piece on d5. But before that, it's actually controlling this b5 square, and we're going to be able to push up a pawn to b5. That's then going to insulate the knight on d5, preventing c4 dislodging it. And it's also going to give us control of the c4 square, keeping this knight from activating. And what we're going to slowly build towards, Matt, is a queenside attack. And that knight is going to be incredibly influential in the middle of the board.
And another note I had about the e5 square that I was thinking earlier, we talked about how important it is to remove white's e-pawn so they don't get a pawn on e5. What's the next best attacking piece to sit on e5 after a pawn for white?
Knight.
The knight, yeah. So this pawn is just doing an awesome job of limiting that knight's scope when the other knight wants to fill in behind it. So really both knights are just like stuck in a waiting queue because
somewhat disabled, by the pawn. And a very subtle thing is very often London players just, I just need a move to pass the turn, and they'll play bishop h2. And if you never move this pawn on d6, that bishop on h2 is just completely locked out of the game. It can never, I guess it's attacking a pawn, but it's a pawn they can never win. So you've actually, they often have 3 ineffectual minor pieces in the middle game, which is really bizarre to see. We'll continue. Rook e1, activating a major piece, makes sense. So now we can play knight cd5. The knight comes to a great square with tempo. Bishop h2, the most common move by far. It's not the best move. Your opponent should actually play here bishop g3 and then bishop h4 to keep the bishop active. But statistically, players don't really do that. They're reflexively bishop h2.
Yeah, it's not intuitive to leave h2 open. You have in the notes, you can sometimes move your king to h2 as white. But as white, I'm always thinking bishop h2 in these positions.
Yeah, it's very, I think you have to have seen it before. Like, it's very hard to find over the board, especially because, again, a lot of London system players, myself included, when you learn to play it, you're learning from a book, you're learning from a course. What's always recommended? Well, if your bishop's attacked, bishop h2. That's why you played h3.
Right.
So, yeah, it makes sense. And so now b5, and we've now secured. B5 is a really nice move because we're preventing c4 dislodging our knight, but we're also subtly, what's this pawn structure, Matt? It's not obvious, but this is a very famous pawn structure.
It looks like a Carlsbad pawn structure, but I'm used to seeing the d pawn up 1 for us.
It is technically a Carlsbad, and we've got a minority attack, and it's not going to begin right now. We need to set it up. I guess, we've talked constantly about the upside of a pawn on d6. Well, one downside of not having a pawn on d5 is when you push b4, they can play c4. So we need to do some organization before we continue with the minority attack. But at this point, that's absolutely our plan in this position, is to continue with that minority attack. Which you recently did a lecture on the ChessGoals YouTube, so that'll be a nice pairing. So Queen e2, just having some pressure here, and now Queen b6. So because of the sequence of moves in this exact variation, we've not had to move our queen yet. So the queen can come very actively to b6, where it supports pushing b4 later. It also laterally defends d6, so this pawn is really well defended. And we're going to just continue to build our position. So we can look at moves like, I really like h6. I keep saying this, so what is the idea of h6? Well, white needs to activate these pieces. And a way that white can do that is actually with knight g5, knight e4. And so by playing h6, not only do you make Luft for your king, which is valuable because this is not an attacking position. The game's going to go on for a long time. But by getting h6 in, you actually make it very difficult to improve this knight. And that's a way that white can activate their pieces and at least bring another attacker to this square. We can also look at moves like rook fc8, starting to control this square. If we can prevent c4 when we push b4, then we're ready to push b4. So that makes sense. And that can also allow you to play the move bishop f8. So now the bishop is defending some kingside squares, but continuing to have a watchful eye on the d pawn. So we're improving the scope of our piece. This is not a position where you're going to blow your opponent off the board. You're going to just need to continue to make small improving moves and slowly organize the minority attack. but black is absolutely in the driver's seat here. White does not actually have an active plan.
I like this type of structure. Okay, so let's go back now to our ninth move. When we played bishop to a6, we looked at bishop takes a6. That's line number 1. Now we're now going to look at pawn to c4, and after that, queen to e2. So let's see what happens after pawn to c4.
Yeah, so white can make this move, and already we've actually achieved just a little something, because they could have played c4 in one move, right? And we've managed to get them to do it in 2 moves, and it's certainly not like our bishop is misplaced on a6. It wasn't my recommendation in the Queen's Indian course, but as something that was alluded to in the Queen's Indian course, we're playing bishop b7, but there's a whole other body of theory attached to bishop a6, which is a completely valid way to develop in the Queen's Indian as well. So we're going to get some of that, but our opponent has spent 2 moves to play c4. Now we hit him with d5, and this is really the only idea to remember. Once we hit them with d5 here, white's now forced into an IQP, and an IQP where their pieces are just a bit weird. Like, you would not normally see a knight on d2 or a bishop on f4 in an IQP. So they're not really set up. The compensation for the isolated queen's pawn is usually an initiative and an attack, and their pieces aren't really set up to do that. So you normally now see b3 trying to avoid the IQP. And so we want to show you how to go about attacking that. Knight c6, we can put the knight on its best square. And I would highlight to you already, Matt, there are some very weak dark squares on the queen side. That's where we're going to be playing. Castles, dc4. Very concrete, but this does give an advantage, and we'll see why. Knight takes c4. This is forced because b takes c3, knight takes d4. That's just a clean pawn. So they can't play the desirable b takes c3. That's why d takes c4 works. And now we can come in with knight b4, trying to grab this bishop. Bishop has to drop back. And now we can put the knight, using the tempo we just gained, blockading the d pawn. So we've still got our IQP. All of our pieces are developed. This bishop's going to have to move. I think we've got a really good position at this point in time. We might even be able to look at knight c3 in the future as well. So I would say black is strategically better, significantly better.
These dark squares on the queen side are a problem. And you have the eval listed in the notes. Minus 1.5. Black has a big advantage here. So that d pawn is probably going to drop at some point too. Okay, let's go back to move number 10. And we'll round it out with queen to e2 by white. So remember, we just played bishop to a6. And now white's threatening to win our bishop. So what are we going to do here?
Yeah, so this is a very common move, and it's quite a good move, to be honest. They may be aware of the system, the setup we're trying to go for, and this is a way of continuing to develop, but also declining to enter that setup. If I were on the white side, this is probably what I would play. Although I don't go in for this. But anyway, so now bishop takes d3. We don't really have another move. You could play queen c8, but then you're sort of getting quite passive, and I think there's no reason to do that. So they capture. Now queen c8, not the only move, but it's a really nice idea that we're going to see in a couple of chapters this course. We're going to bring the queen to b7 and fight for this long diagonal, because we obviously in this structure, well, a light square bishop on b7 would be an amazing piece. Well, the queen functions the same as a light square bishop on the long diagonal. So we're just going to put the queen there. It's the best square for the queen. Castles, now h6. Not the only move. You could play knight d7. You could play queen b7. This is certainly not a chapter where move by move is necessarily critical. So I wanted to illustrate some ideas. The idea of h6 is white is going to have trouble activating these pieces because they don't have the e5 square. That's really where these pieces would be activated. And this bishop is just going to be staring into this d6 pawn the entire game. So white can actually take advantage of the g5 square. We've mentioned this previously, to improve their pieces. So before they can even start maneuvering, we're going to take away the g5 square and make life very difficult for white to place their pieces actively. Rook fe1 makes sense. And now queen b7. And the queen's extremely well positioned on this diagonal. well, this diagonal even, fighting for these central light squares. And here it's just an even position. We're going to continue with moves like knight c6. They didn't take on a6, so we can just place the knight really actively. We can put rooks in the center. It's just a good position. Bishop f8 is a very common improving move when you already have the pawn on h6. Why? Sometimes players with the white pieces will try and play queen e3 and then sacrifice on h6 because they get desperate and they need to drum up some play. If you see that, putting the bishop on f8 to overprotect the h6 pawn really shuts that down completely.
I like the strategic nature of this position, James, where it's like we're using the pawns to control dark squares and we have the pieces controlling the light squares. A great book, kind of talking about light and dark squares, is by Axel Smith. I just finished reading it. The paperback is called, I think, Black and White Magic, and I believe it has a different name if you buy it on Chessable. But that's a really good book, and I think this position would be a great example of some of his points on how to control color complexes. All right, so now let's go back to our 8th move. We played pawn to d6. We just looked at bishop to d3, and we're going to look at pawn to a4 next, and then we're going to wrap up this move by looking at bishop to e2. So let's start with pawn to a4.
Yeah, so this is a pretty good try, actually. I would even say a critical attempt, and this comes from the game Esipenko-Leko, so two 2,700 plus GMs. And the idea here, and this is like, it's a cool idea. They want to meet bishop a6 with bishop b5, where if we take, the pawn on b5 is really controlling our queenside expansion. So a really good idea from White. I've never faced this. It's extremely rare in the club database, but it's a critical attempt. And something I'm aware of as now someone at the chess club who's published courses on the Nimzo and Queen's Indian is people can prepare for you, right? If they know that you play this stuff. So I think this would be something that your opponent could prepare for you if they know that they have to face you. And I think it's important for me preparing courses to present that stuff as well. So you've seen it before and you don't get tricked. So we're just going to follow what Leko did because he's brilliant and I don't think we can improve on it. So Leko played bishop a6 anyway, going into the idea, bishop b5, and now knight d5. And this is the only move you need to remember. So rather than going knight a6, knight c7, knight d5 to get a tempo, we're going to go the other way now, forcing the dark square bishop to move. Now you can take, and now you can actually turn this. Now we're just going to go and try and win your pawn. And this just all your pieces are going to seamlessly flow into the position after this. So really all you need to remember is the slightly strange knight fd5 maneuver. And then the rest of these moves are pretty straightforward. So White defended in the game with queen e2. And now Leko just played a6, trading off the pawn. Because it is restricting us. And so we just want to get rid of it. We're going to have a weak pawn of our own. But remember, our long-term plan is just to push that up and trade it off on c3. So you're almost going to have like a Benko Gambit type position where we have these open A and B files to play with. And like White's not anywhere near a meaningful kingside attack. And we have excellent control of the g5 square, which would be the staging point for White to launch an attack. So we're very, very safe here. So a6, Esipenko took. Maybe they can take. They don't have to take, but he took. Rook takes a6 now. Most precise, just offering a trade, which is going to help us untangle our pieces, activate this knight on b8. Castles, b5, controlling the c4 square. One day we're going to push this pawn up as well. The pawn on b5 is extremely good in these positions, Matt, because it insulates the d5 square so that when the knight comes to d5, it can't be kicked away. But it controls the c4 square, which prevents this knight from activating. So pawn on b5, you see that a lot, very, very useful. Esipenko played rook takes a6. Leko played the knight on b takes a6, rook a1, and now queen d7, just completing development. And the game ended in a draw. Leko was pushing at points. It's a game worth studying, Esipenko, Leko. Black is very close to pushing b4 here when they would have an advantage, but because White is able to meet b4 with c4, some more work needs to be done. And what Leko did in the game, which was a very nice maneuver, realizing that, he actually put his queen on c6. And the queen on c6 guards this knight, guards this knight, guards this pawn, controls this square. So really sets up everything in preparation for b4. So that's a good illustrative game. He also continued with rook c8 just to further control the c4 square. But black's completely untangled here. It's even according to the engine, but strategically, who's pushing for an advantage? Well, if you can ever get b4 in, what black's pushing for an advantage.
One thing I like about this line, so it's cutting edge, and it to me appears
to
be one of the strongest lines that white can play. It's the strongest we've seen so far in this chapter. What I like about it, though, is as a London player, you're always thinking, play my system moves, attack kingside, right? You just system, kingside, system, kingside. Yeah. Well, you have to think to play a4. Like, you're never coming up with that over the board. So you definitely have to be shifting gears as a London player to even know to attack on the queen side.
Yeah, it's pretty deep. I think that actually is white's best line in the whole chapter. Okay. And black is equal pushing. So I really love this setup. Again, as a London player, I don't allow this. You can use move order tricks to avoid it from the white side. So yeah, this is pretty nasty. So bishop e2. They don't have to play bishop d3. They can play bishop e2. Now, I did think about briefly recommending bishop b7, but like, do you really want to have to learn a lot more stuff? I don't. So we're going to play bishop a6 and offer that transposition. So white can just now transpose to our main line with bishop takes a6. So we won't cover that move here. Instead, we'll look at some independent tries. Castles makes sense. Here, not the only move, but I really recommend just bishop takes on e2. Why? Well, I don't want to have to do the knight tour if I don't have to. I would like to just put my knight on its best natural square, being c6. So we can just trade. This is still a good trade for us, getting rid of their light square bishop, which, yes, was slightly misplaced, but it's a very, very good piece. So it's a fine trade for us. Queen takes e2, knight c6. We get to put the knight on the best square. That's the point. Rook fe1, which is white's most common developing move. And now we can play rook c8, defending the knight. We're probably going to transfer the queen over to b7. We've talked about that. A little detail, just a little theme I would highlight here, Matt, is you do need, with all this pressure down the e-file, you need to be aware of d5 as a tactical shot can sometimes cause trouble, because you aren't going to have e-takes, is you can run into trouble down the e-file. Doesn't work here now, not even close to working here now, just to be clear, but I just thought I'd highlight it to the viewers. A tactical motif in this position, because we haven't got that pawn on d5, is they can sometimes play d5 themselves as a pawn sacrifice. So just be aware of that. Here, though, not a big deal. We've got knight takes. If you never want to have to deal with it, you can just play rook e8, and then it never works. So you've just got that option. This is just a completely even position. You might continue with something like, again, h6, preventing knight g5, queen d7, queen b7. And then you're just going to push up your minority attack.
So would you ever recommend in a position like this playing pawn to d5, or should we always keep it back on d6?
No, we're getting like very deep into the middle game now, but very often when most of the pieces have been traded off, the only way to play b4 without allowing them to push c4 is eventually to put your pawn on d5, because you just have to control that square to complete the minority attack. But you usually delay it as long as possible before doing it. So you might end up in a position where there's no heavy pieces, like say no rooks. You might have like London bishop and one knight, often versus this knight and this bishop and your queen. All your pieces are well positioned for the minority attack, and then finally you say, okay, I'll push d5 now. The London bishop will be on h2, where it's influencing two squares that you're not using.
Right.
So you can allow it back into the game at that point. So that you can, once you push d5, you control c4, you can push b4. So that's very far in the distance. This is not a setup that gives quick wins for black. These are slow, grindy games. But you're never in any danger, and that's often why black is scoring so well.
So now let's go back to move number 7. This is when we first captured on d4. And James mentioned that c takes d4 does give white a bit of a funny pawn structure in combination with that knight on d2 that would really like to be on c3. So this recapture is actually an inaccuracy by white. So what are we going to do here?
Yeah, I get this a lot for some reason. I'm not sure why. But
Are
I
they
do
playing
get
for
it.
draws maybe? Like they just see symmetric pawns?
Because I'm I'm over. It's my blitz rating like almost 2200. So I'm playing strong blitz players. But it is these are I mostly get it in blitz. I've never had this recapture in a slower time control. So maybe it's just like an instinctive decision that they haven't really thought through.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Okay. Actually, I have a theory. I think they're thinking, oh, I'm going to be able to play e4 and have this broad pawn center. That gives me an advantage. We will see that, and we will see why that's actually not how it plays out. So I think it's just not understanding that you're never really going to meaningfully achieve that. So d6 here, controlling. Again, we're not playing the bishop out because we're waiting for them to deploy their bishop. So that idea is still absolutely in play. Bishop e2 is the main move. They could play bishop d3 as well. It's not going to make any difference because bishop a6. So cutting down on theory, I suppose, for our benefit. Still a strong idea, and still the engine top move. Castles, most common. Bishop, I've got in the notes, bishop takes knight a6. We just see ideas that we've already seen before. Same sort of redeploying of the knight, a6, c7. Not a big deal. Actually, indeed, without the pawn on c3, you can often go knight a6, knight b4, and come in quite aggressively. So that helps us as well. Here we have queen d7, h6 would be fine as well. The queen is coming to b7. Rook c1, and now h6. So like I said, it could be in the other move order. Taking control of g5 to prevent them from improving their pieces. So we can continue in the distance with bishop takes e2, knight c6, and then rook fc8, clearing the back rank. Everything is connected. We've got very nice active pieces. White's, so how do I, is it control to do a different color?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So white's scary idea, I'll put all of our moves back on the board. White's idea, right, is to play e4, e5. And so you need to know how to deal with that. What we can do is nothing. And then when they push e5, you play d takes e5, they play d takes e5, and then you just put your knight on d5 where it's an outposted knight in the center of the board that they can never get rid of.
Yeah, and then their e-pawn blocks their own bishop, and this.
And then black is just better.
I like those.
And that's the problem. That's the problem with this is I've had this executed against me and the times it comes up, and they do all their moves, and they often have to, because your queen's going to be on b7, they have to spend all these moves to organize e4, then organize e5, and then they're just worse after they execute all these ideas. And so it's just not a scary variation.
The play is on the queen side there, and they just locked up their pieces on the king side, it seems. Just to guard the e-pawn.
So we're going to be playing on the queen side, which is absolutely where the action is. So c takes, it's not like it's just inaccurate because it's not understanding what the position requires.
Yep. Okay, so now let's go to our 6th move. We castled and we looked at knight b to d2. Now we'll just cover one line. What happens if white plays the early bishop to d3 and keeps that knight back, at least for a few moves?
Yeah, so our broad rule in this chapter and the Torre chapter, which is related, is we don't play c takes d4 until this knight has moved. So we're going to keep with our rule here. They've played bishop d3 instead. So rather than c takes d4 and bishop a6 like we saw in the main line, we're just going to hit him with bishop a6 directly. We just don't insert the c takes d4, because if we do, then c takes back is really good because the knight can come to c3. So we're just not going to give him that option. No active play for white in this chapter. White normally castles. Again, they could take, we'll take back. Indeed, in my games, people mostly do take, but we're still going to get a position from the main line because at some point they're going to have to put the knight on d2 and then you take. So it would just transpose to the main line. Here we can take they take. And in this position, the best move is actually d5. And I say it's a great positional move because it prevents them from pushing the immediate e4. Our knight hasn't been forced to a6, so we're going to be able to put the knight on a6. And black just has a really great position. Now, I did go and check this with the engine because, okay, what if you don't remember in this position you can play d5? Black is also equal with d6. So either you're fine either way. Indeed, some players might prefer to play, with the d6 and not allow knight coming to e5. So that's a totally reasonable preference. It's even either way. I do think d5 is a slightly stronger move, but both are fine. Of course, you've played d5, which invites knight e5 because you haven't taken control of the square. So we'll look at that. Here we have queen c8. We see this over and over again in the part 3 course, Matt. The idea is actually to prepare knight c6. If we can't play knight c6 now, of course, because they will just take. But we're also going to bring the queen to b7. We still want to have really good control of the e4 square. Knight d2. And now we can play, knight d7, developing our last minor piece and preparing to trade. We can continue with natural moves here like queen b7. We still would want to look at a move like h6, and then we'll move the rooks, probably play bishop f8. In the long run, we're still going to actually play now c4, b5, b4, and complete the minority attack like that.
I love those positions where the light bishops are off the board. And I don't know if this is the correct term, but it's like you're fianchettoing the queen, right? You put her on the square.
That is what you're doing. And we do that a lot. And I guess the point I just constantly keep reiterating is, well, if the bishop would be so good on b7, surely the queen is just as good. It has the same functions, and it's a much scarier attacker. So the queen stands really, really well in these structures on b7. So you'll see that very commonly, and it gets there via often c8, sometimes d7.
And if you compare and contrast having our bishop on b7 with their bishop on d3 versus having the bishops off, I would definitely prefer the bishops off because the queen on b7, like you highlighted, guards e4 and, ushers the b pawn along the board. So it's like even better than a bishop on b7.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. It also defends the knight laterally, which maybe could be tactically important. But if they had a bishop on d3, then they actually do have a pretty fierce kingside attack coming. Without the bishop on d3, they don't, which is really important.
Yeah, I'm excited for the next two lines because we are looking at what happens when white does not play h3. So going back to move 5, we just played bishop e7. Everything we looked at just now was pawn to h3. Let's see what happens when white plays knight b to d2 and they keep the h-pawn back.
Yeah, so this is more common at the club level, just not recognizing the threat of knight to h5. So that's fine. We should still start with castles. We're not in a rush to grab the London bishop. It can't really go anywhere. So it's just it's a sitting duck until they play h3 anyway. If we are going to try and grab it, we want to grab it on the best possible terms. Bishop d3, most popular. Now we can take. Why do we take before playing bishop a6? Well, this knight, following our rule, this knight has come to d2, so we're not scared of c takes. They take back with the e-pawn. It's the most accurate. We've seen what c takes looks like, and now we can just play bishop a6. And this play is very, very similar to the main line. It's the same themes. We might be able to hunt down this London bishop if they don't play h3. Often they will, and you just get a full transposition. But our ideas are still the same. So let's say they take, knight takes a6. How would you continue? We're going to look at ideas like d6, knight c7, queen c8, queen b7, all the same ideas that we've seen before. You don't need to learn anything new, but there's the added wrinkle that you might be able to just play knight h5 and grab the bishop pair. One other bishop pair, grab the London bishop, which is still desirable.
Yeah, I like that. And it's easy to remember because it's just so similar to everything we've looked at so far.
It's exactly the same, yeah. Now, on move 7 in this line after 6 knight b2, instead of bishop d3, they actually can play bishop e2, and this is very popular. People, and I think, not to be rude, Knight BD2 without H3 is very much like a club player move, like they're just playing the system moves. And I think Bishop E2 goes with that because the best move is Bishop D3 if you're going down this continuation. But they think, oh, the bishop's going to B7. I want to reinforce my knight. So I think Bishop E2 goes with that sort of psychology. This is a big mistake. Now we do actually have Knight H5, and this works because on D3 the bishop actually is defending this bishop because of Bishop H7 check when the knight moves away. So if you can imagine, we played Knight H5, bishop takes check, and then they have Knight G5 followed by Queen takes H5. They don't have that here, and so now the bishop can't go back to H2. It can't go back to E3. It could go to E5, but you would just play D6 and get a free move in. So Bishop G3 is the logical conclusion. D6 now, we're in no rush to take the bishop because our knight's not tactically in any danger here. So D6, just controlling the square, making a valuable move. We want Matt to delay taking here until white castles because otherwise we would be giving them the open H file, which would give them a little bit of play in the position. So we're just going to sit tight. Castles. Now knight takes G3. We have achieved the bishop pair. H takes G3. And you could play bishop A6 here. I'm actually going to break ranks and recommend bishop B7. Why? Well, we have the bishop pair. I'd like to play with that for a while and not give it straight back. Yeah, so just a very nice position. White is in no way. So white's goal here, again, in this pawn structure is a kingside attack. Well, that's not happening at the moment with the bishop one. Like, yeah, white's nowhere near a kingside attack. We're ready to keep improving our pieces and then continue with the minority attack. So yeah, black is already better here.
The hard thing for white is they got all their system moves in, and then it's like, well, now what? When you don't have the kingside attack, they really feels like they're missing out on something out of the opening.
Yeah, this pawn on D6 is like absolutely brutal for just shutting down how you would normally move forward in the London.
Yeah, I purchased a chess base course a long time ago. It was actually a Benko course by Alejandro Ramirez, and he had some kind of like I can't remember if it was double fianchetto or similar to this, but it was very annoying for London players, and I used it to get pretty good results for a while just because no one knew what to do in those positions.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we got a crazy looking move, Queen F3, but you mentioned it earlier. The queen is immediately eyeing this rook in the corner, so we don't have bishop b7. We either have to go d5 or block with the knight.
Yeah, so there are now two courses on that I've seen, one by Ginger GM, and I forget the other one, but it's on Chessable, where they're recommending for Queen F3. So if we actually go back one move, here, for Queen F3 doesn't do anything because of the C5 move order that we've played. So that's the key point. But you're going to have players that are like, well, surely it works a move later, right? So yeah. C3, B6, and now Queen F3. Like, surely this is still good. And it's not obvious why it's not good, so we're going to cover it. But this is not a good move. White is worse now. We have knight C6, okay? Closing the diagonal. Knight D2 is most common. Often that white combines Queen F3 with long castle. So knight D2 is preparing long castle. Bishop B7. We're now lining up a pretty monster discovery at some point in the future. Continuing development, that's good. White plays Queen H3 here. It's the main move. They don't want to run into that discovery because you can do some pretty funky stuff like Knight B4 or knight takes on D4 in some positions as well can work tactically. So white usually won't allow this. Queen H3. Now Knight D5, attacking this bishop. Forcing bishop G3. If they let you take, their structure's completely compromised and you're just better strategically speaking. So bishop G3, C takes D4, trying to win the B4 square for this knight, and then coming in because white's actually really, their development's really awkward. E takes D4 because they don't want to give you the B4 square, makes sense. But the problem with that is now that this bishop doesn't have any retreats, it can't get to the E3 square. and they've lost with their last move, pawn takes here. They've lost some control, or they've lost control of the f4 square, so the bishop can't come back, which all builds towards h5. And we are just threatening to push a pawn and win a piece. There haven't been many games here. This is a really difficult position for white to hold. Black almost always wins. White can hold with some very computery defense, but black already has a big advantage.
This does not look fun to play for white at all. Your queen on h3.
Yeah, like the queen on h3, the bishop that isn't really doing anything. I mean, they can play f3, right? And then your knight's coming in. You've still got this really strong bishop on the diagonal. We can potentially castle long if we don't want to castle short because we have moved our king. So like everything has just worked out really well for black and really poorly for white.
So let's go now to our third move. We're going way back. We just played c5, and all of those lines we looked at were pawn to c3. We're going to look at d takes c5 for one line, and then we will circle back to knight f3 on move 4 for the final 3 lines. So let's start with d takes c5. You said you've never faced this, but apparently it's played 3% of the time. So you guys are going to see this in some of your games.
Yeah, it's I kind of get it, right? Like, no, I kind of don't get it. I don't get this move.
You know what it reminds
was
me of? A Queen's Gambit accepted a little bit. Like they maybe think, oh, okay, you're going to go d5. I'm going to go c4. These pawns all swap, swap, swap. To me, it's like someone who likes draws would play this move.
Yeah. So anyway, obviously we can just recapture with tempo. So that's pretty obvious and strong move. Knight f3, just knight c6. There's white doesn't have a strong grip in the middle. Indeed, we've both only got one pawn on the third rank. So we can just put all of our pieces really, really actively. Bishop d3 is the main move. And now just d5. Like white's allowed us to take space in the middle. So we're going to take space in the middle. And I think black already is very slightly better. Castles, natural, knight bd2, and now rook e8. So the only question we have left to solve, Matt, for black to claim an opening advantage is just we need to get this bishop out. I don't much care. I really like the Tartakower Caro-Kann. I don't much care for the Tartakower Queen's Gambit Declined, which is these pawns with b6 and bishop b7. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to play rook e8, and we're going to organize e5 when our bishop can just come out along this diagonal. So that's our plan. They often talk about like micro plans before you execute your big plan. So our micro plan is just getting out our light square bishop. White should recognize, I'm just going to give white all the best moves. White should recognize they need to occupy the e5 square and prevent us from pushing e5. So knight e5. I say in the comments on anything else we play e5, or almost anything else, I suppose. So now we can just bring our bishop back. We're going to fight for this e5 square. Once we win control of e5, we can push e5 and bring this bishop out, and we'll be better.
I think in practice, you're going to see a lot of players that don't fight for e5, especially if you're a beginner, maybe intermediate level. I think in practice, you're going to steamroll some people just going e5, e4, control that center.
I mean, if you go back to here and let's give them like a random move like c3, black's already quite a bit better.
I think you're winning a piece. Yeah,
it's a huge threat. Yeah, like it's a big threat. e5. So yeah, knight e5. Knight takes c6 is the best move. Very briefly, they can try and reinforce, but you just have queen c7, and you're forcing a mass exchange of pieces and then e5. So that's not a problem at all. So knight takes c6, b takes c6. Bishop takes c6, queen takes d6. And they can't stop us pushing e5 on the next move. Indeed, they've improved our pawn structure. So we're going to have, can do it this way. Some very nice pawns in the middle, more central space. All of our pieces will be active. And we've actually got a very slight lead in development as well. So unsurprisingly, black's doing quite well from here.
Yeah, this looks great. So let's go now to move number 4, the final option for white. Knight f3, and you put in the notes, usually this will transpose to the main line, but we're going to look at some other kind of tricky ideas in this position.
Yeah, so there are a couple of tricky moves. There's like videos on YouTube, which is like 15 London system traps to win quick.
Right.
There are a couple that do feature the Queen's Indian. They're not actually that good, but if you've never seen them before, they can trap you. So I just thought for completeness, well, I'll cover them because you don't need to know too much. They're just trying to move order you, but according to the database, actually, people who play knight f3, and I'll be clear, I play knight f3 here, usually are just trying to transpose, but they're trying to get the best possible version of the main line. That's all. So in this exact position, now we do just play c takes d4. And the reason why will be revealed shortly. b6. And now we look at the two tricky tries. So normally they transpose. The only drawback to playing like this, Matt, here is theoretically your opponent could play c4 and knight c3, which might seem like a problem, except that you already have the Queen's Indian defense course, and this is just a transposition to a 4 bishop f4 Queen's Indian, which is good for black. So you don't have to worry about allowing this. And for those of you who haven't got that course, I'll give you a very quick test run. You meet knight c3 with bishop b4.
And go get
and
the
then
course.
You're better. Yeah, and you should go get the course. But that's the idea. It's not scary. So we'll cover the independent tries because we're not going to cover stuff that's already covered in the course. So knight c3. This is one of those tricky trappies. They just want knight b5 and then coming into either of these two weak dark squares. So that's fairly threatening. That's fairly scary. Here we just have bishop b7. White was actually additionally immediately threatening to push d5. So we actually have to play bishop b7 to take control of this square. Knight b5, they want to come into here and here. Just d6, it prevents both. Now the knight can't come in, and now the knight certainly can't come into d6. It's sufficiently controlled. White normally continues with c4. We have a6, pushing back the knight, taking control of the b5 square, knight c3. And now an idea that we've already seen in this chapter, can just hit him with d5. And we're going to force that IQP position on good terms for us. Again, quite a comfortable position for black. Certainly nothing to worry about here.
Yeah, we're getting some really nice IQPs in this chapter, James. I like this a lot.
Yeah. Like IQP is like normally very even, very dynamic, but we're getting
Right.
IQPs where their pieces are misplaced. So they're not as dynamic as they should be. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not getting the kingside pressure that normally they would want. So we just looked at knight c3 here. Let's look at pawn to c4.
Yeah, so this is just, like I was saying, this is just transposing to that bishop f4 Queen's Indian. So you can just play bishop b7 here. The main move is knight c3. You hit him with bishop b4. Life's good. This is good for black.
Okay, so one line left. Back here.
Knight BD. Have we done 6 knight BD2? So after 4 knight f3, yeah. Put these moves on the board.
Oh, thank you.
And then they can also play this knight BD2 idea. Now, this is a little bit different. This is a little bit more threatening. The idea here is just knight c4, knight d6. Here, I'm recommending bishop e7. They want to give check on d6 and win the bishop pair because you're going to have to play bishop takes d6. So we're just going to get castled as quickly as possible. So bishop e7. Knight c4, they want to give that check. We can castle. They can come into d6, and I probably should have given this move an exclam. Maybe we can do that in the notes afterwards. You can just play bishop a6 here, and not letting them play knight takes c8, just ignoring the knight for now, which we'll see will become a tactical liability. So bishop takes a6. What else? If they don't take, we're going to take and take away castling rights. Knight takes a6, bishop g3. This is a forced move. So trap 1. Now we've got all the traps because we're so ahead in development. If they don't play bishop takes g3, it might seem weird. You can actually step into the pin with queen c7, exploiting that this bishop is undefended. And then you're just taking the knight, and there's nothing they can do about it.
That's an unexpected trap too. I like that a lot.
It's like a Uno reversal card.
Yeah,
it's actually you that is trapped.
That's great.
And
they got to draw 4, and then it all just goes downhill.
It's all done. Yeah, it's also very wild. So they have to play bishop g3. I don't think that's an obvious move, right? So bishop g3, or they are just losing. And now the next tricky trappy move, knight h5. We're just threatening to remove the defender and take the knight. So uh, things have turned around very suddenly, and White's not having a good time.
You know what I would play here for white though? In blitz, queen
Talk
d3.
to me.
Then you take the bishop, then I take back, then you take the knight, and then I'll mate on h7.
Yeah.
No,
There are some tricks. So we actually cover. So I was just thinking, we actually cover very similar to that in the notes. So
yeah.
c3, for example, knight c7. So knight c7 was forced because if we took immediately, there is issue with bishop g6. There is issues with queen d3, and even if you defend mate, they can just collect the knight on a6. So we're getting the knight away. We're also waiting for them to hopefully castle. So we're not in a rush to win this piece because it's not going anywhere. We are going to win that bishop. So the knight comes back to c4, and now we can play just d6, preventing occupation of this square. We're going to be able to continue with b5 and then the knight into the middle. So there are some threats you need to be aware of, like Matt said, queen d3. You don't want to, like we've talked about in this chapter, you don't want to capture too early and allow them h-file pressure. We also did have to deal with our weak knight on our loose knight rather on a6, but you can very quickly see things have just not worked out for white at all. So they've gone in for tricks and traps in the opening. Who's emerged with an advantage? It's black.
Very nice. So that was the 14th and final line of the chapter. James, do you have any final thoughts for this chapter 1 on the London system?
Yeah, I mean, definitely enjoy it. From the London, as a London player, you're often trying to inflict slow suffering on your opponent, and it's a real reversal of roles in this chapter. You are playing for a long-term advantage based on the pawn structure. You want to achieve that minority attack and get these like two outcome positions where it's either a draw or a win for black. So just be patient. You're in no rush to execute the minority attack. So just constantly try and play prophylactically, take away their active play, and eventually you'll get in that b4 move. And then maybe you'll win, maybe you'll not, but you're in the driver's seat.
Very nice. All right, we'll see you guys in chapter 2.